The Story of Civilization, Volume 7, The Age of Reason Begins, by Will and Ariel Durant, Part 2, continued, Cassette 6, Side 2. The Dutch Protestants felt that medieval church architecture and decoration had been forms of indoctrination, perpetuating legends and discouraging thought. They decided to worship God with prayer and sermons rather than with art. The only art they kept in their ritual was song. So their ecclesiastical architecture aimed at an almost stark simplicity. Even the Catholics raised no memorable churches in the United Provinces. Overseas merchants in the 16th century brought in, perhaps from Syria or Egypt, the idea of bulbous cupolas. The fashion spread from Holland and Russia into Germany and became a feature of Central European Baroque. Businessmen, not the clergy, dominated Dutch architecture, and first of all they built themselves sturdy dwellings, almost all alike, not instilling fear like the Florentine palace, nor arousing envy. The luxury and art were all inside, and in the flower gardens carefully tended. Their civic buildings allowed more ornament and pride. Leeuwenhoek brought French, German, and Renaissance elements into a remarkable harmony in the Rathaus, or town hall, that he built for Leiden. The Hall of the Butchers' Guild at Haarlem, also by Leeuwenhoek, is as proud as a Gothic cathedral. The town hall at The Hague shows the classic style completely domesticated in Holland. The Michelangelo of Dutch architecture and sculpture in this age was Hendrik de Keyser, who became city architect of Amsterdam at the age of 29 in 1594. There he designed the Westerkerk, the Exchange, and the East India House, all in Italian-Dutch Renaissance style. At Delft he built the town hall and the monument to William I, and in 1627 at Rotterdam he cast in bronze his masterpiece, the noble statue of Erasmus, which for some years sat calmly intact amid the ruins of the Second World War. Some of the loveliest Dutch structures dating from this period lost their lives in that failure of statesmanship. Pottery shone among the minor arts. In Rotterdam and Delft, tiles were an industry that good taste made an art. Delft raised its faience to a place in nearly every home in the Netherlands. About 1610, soon after the opening of Dutch trade with the Orient, Delft potters began to imitate Chinese ware and produced a thin blue majolica called Hollands porcelain. Soon half the Western European world displayed Delft pottery on its walls or shelves. The one major art in the Netherlands was painting. Never elsewhere in known history, not excepting Renaissance Italy, did an art win such pervasive popularity. For the years between 1580 and 1700, the art catalogues list 15,000 Dutch paintings. Italian influence dominated Flemish art, but in the northern provinces the successful resistance to Spanish power aroused a nationalistic spirit and pride that needed only the wealth derived from overseas trade to produce a cultural explosion. Art was turned into new channels of domesticity and realism by the almost complete withdrawal of ecclesiastical and aristocratic patronage. The new patrons were merchants, burgomasters, lawyers, corporations, guilds, communes, hospitals, even almshouses, hence the portraits, group pictures, and genre. Nearly every Dutch city had its school of artists, nourished by local patronage: Haarlem, Leiden, Utrecht, Amsterdam, Dordrecht, Delft, The Hague. Simple citizens who in other lands might have been, in art, illiterate dependents of the church, adorned their homes with pictures, sometimes bought at considerable cost. So a baker proved his good taste by paying 600 florins, or about $7,500, for a single figure by Vermeer. Secularization was almost complete. Saints went out as subjects, merchants came in. The home and the fields triumphed over the church. Realism flourished. The bourgeois sitter appreciated a little idealization of himself and his wife, but dikes and dunes, windmills and cottages, sailing ships and cluttered docks pleasantly refreshed on the walls the memory of actual and common things. Jolly topers, tavern tipplers, even bordeltjes were welcomed into homes that a century earlier might have shown saintly martyrs, historic heroes, or pagan gods. Nudes were out of style. In that damp climate, with those stout forms, nudity was no delight. The Italian cult of beauty, refinement, and dignity seemed out of place in this new environment, which asked nothing more of art than the reproduction of daily life and familiar scenes. There was a sad side to this picture of a nation mad about pictures. The artists who painted them lived for the most part in poverty and low esteem. In Flanders, the Archduke, the lords, and the bishops paid their chosen artists well. But in Holland, the painters, competing individually, produced for the common market and they reached customers largely through dealers who grew up between producer and purchaser and who knew how to buy cheap and sell dear. Dutch artists rarely received high prices. At the crest of his fame, Rembrandt earned only 1,600 guilders by the night watch, Van Goyen only 600 by his view of The Hague, and much less for the rest. Jan Steen painted 3 portraits for 27 guilders. Isaac van Ostade sold 13 of his pictures for a like sum. Many Dutch artists had to do extraneous work to butter their bread. Van Goyen sold tulips. Hobbema was a tax collector. Steen kept an inn. The artists themselves were so numerous that they glutted their market. A list of the famous ones would fill pages, and a list of their treasured works would crowd a book. 8. Frans Hals, 1580 to 1666. His ancestors had lived for 2 centuries in Haarlem. His father was a magistrate there, but for unknown reasons Frans was born in Antwerp. Not till he was 19 did he return to live in Haarlem. We hear no more of him till 1611, when the registry of a Haarlem church notes the baptism of Herman, son of Frans Hals, and his wife Anneke. The next record is from a police court in 1616, telling how Frans Hals, arrested for undue beating of his wife, was severely reprimanded and was dismissed on his undertaking to be more gentle and to avoid drunken company. 7 months later Anneke died. 5 months thereafter, in 1617, Frans married Lisbeth Reiniers. 9 days later she gave him the first of 10 children. He has left us an admirable picture of himself and this second wife. She lived with him through his remaining 47 years, putting up with all his impecuniosity and drunken bouts. There was nothing very attractive about him except that he was a great painter and a jolly soul. He was already 36 when he achieved a major success, the banquet of the officers of St. Joris's shooting guild, the first of the 5 Doelen pictures that gave Hals his rank. The Doelen were the headquarters of volunteers who practiced marksmanship, held competitions and social gatherings, and served as communal militia. Occasionally the officers of such guilds would pay an artist to paint their portraits as a group, each individual insisting that his prominence in the picture should be proportioned to his grade in the company and his contribution to the cost. Here, then, are these officers, decked out in their best finery, gathered around a feast, with one of them carrying the colorful standard of the company. Hals earned his fee, for each of these heads is an individual and powerful portrait, each different, each a biography and a masterpiece. We do not hear of another such assignment till 11 years later, but in the interval he produced pictures that are among the prizes of Dutch art. The Herring Cellar, again a history in a face. The Merry Trio and Junker Ramp and his girl, both in New York. The famous Laughing Cavalier, self-confidence incarnate, with all his fortune on his back in ruff and frills and flowered cloak, and a smile almost as subtle as La Gioconda's. And in this period, around 1624, Frans painted his self-portrait, a strong and handsome face with wistful eyes denying the pride of the fine clothes and folded arms. The man was a bruised shuttlecock between the hunger for perfection and the thirst for drink. In 1627 came the second Doelen group, another officers of St. Joris's guild, not so clear and bright as the first. Hals deliberately turned for a time from the easy brilliance of strong colors to the more difficult manipulation of the minor keys, half-tones, gray shadows, softer outlines. Another Doelen of that year, St. Adrian's Shooting Guild, is also in subdued tones. The shooters must have been pleased, for they commissioned Hals to paint them again in 1633. Now the artist recalled his colors and displayed his genius for making every face interesting and unique. In 1639 he painted still another officers of St. Joris's Guild, but here the individual is lost in the crowd. All in all, these Doelen are among the outstanding group pictures of all time. They illustrate the emergence of the middle class into proud prominence in Dutch history and art. In his second period, 1626 to 1650, Hals painted portraits that cry out for remembrance. The Jolly Toper, under a hat large enough to cover a multitude of drinks. The Sand Runner, disheveled and ragged and charming. The Gypsy, or La Bohemienne, smiling and bulging in the Louvre. The Jester in Amsterdam. The fanciful Balthazar Coymans in Washington. And as the climax of this maturity, Hals's supreme picture, The Regents of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. So like, so unlike Rembrandt's Syndics of the Drapers' Guild, painted 21 years afterward. Frans's incalculable carouses, though they do not seem to have injured his art, had hurt his standing, even in a land and a time that took occasional intoxication as an ode to joy. He continued to paint pictures that would have made any artist famous. Hilleboba, the Witch of Haarlem, the disenchanting Descartes, enormous eyebrows, enormous nose, eyes saying dubito, and painted at the age of 80, young man in a slouch hat. But meanwhile disasters multiplied. In 1639, Hals's son Peter was sent to an insane asylum at municipal expense. In 1641, his wayward eldest daughter, at her mother's request, was put into a workhouse. By 1650, Franz was destitute. In 1654, the local baker sued him for a debt of 200 gulden and attached the painter's goods. In 1662, the broken old man applied for and received poor relief. 2 years later, the Haarlem Council voted him a yearly pension and an immediate gift of 3 loads of peat to fire his hearth. Probably as additional alms, he was given, in this year 1664, a commission to paint 2 pictures: the regents of the almshouse and the women regents of the almshouse. The male group shows the unsteady hand of the artist's 84 years. Many features are daubed in vaguely, but in the companion piece, the Regensen, the old skill has surprisingly returned. Here are 5 souls drawn out into their obedient faces, 5 old women wasted with unwanted tasks, prim and stern with their Puritan code, forgetting the joys and frolics of their youth. Yet through those grim features somehow shines a timid kindliness, a weary sympathy. These final pictures, last flames of the painter's fire, now with the great Deulen canvases, hang in the Frans Hals Museum that Haarlem built on the site of that almshouse. He died a pauper in 1664, but he was given honorable burial in the chancel of St. Bavon's in the city whose fame rests upon a long-resisted siege and the works of her greatest son. For 2 centuries thereafter he was almost forgotten. His pictures sold for pittances, or by auction, or not at all. If historians of art remembered him, it was to note the narrowness of his range. No religious pictures, no mythologies, no histories, no landscapes, no nudes. Or the apparently careless haste of his method. No preliminary sketches, but rapid daubs and slashes of color that relied on suggestion and the beholder's memory to fill in details. Today, a possibly exaggerated acclaim balances that long neglect, and one generous critic considers Hals the most brilliant executant of portraits the world has seen. Where time, the safest judge, so vacillates in its judgment, let us be content to admire. 9. Rembrandt van Rijn, 1609 to 1669. He was born at Leiden to a prosperous miller, Gerrit Harmens, who added Van Rijn to his name, probably because his house overlooked the Rhine. The artist must have loved his father, for he painted him 11 times or more, in lordly hat and chain, and as a money-changer, and as a noble Slav, a strong, well-modeled face bristling with character, and in 1629 as a man sombered with age. His mother, too, he pictured a dozen times, most memorably in the old woman of the Vienna Gallery, worried and worn. In the Rijksmuseum at Amsterdam we see her poring over a Bible. If, as some believe, she was a Mennonite, we can better understand Rembrandt's predilection for the Old Testament and his closeness to the Jews. At 14 he entered the University of Leiden, but he thought in other forms than ideas or words. After a year he withdrew and persuaded his father to let him study art. He did so well that in 1623 he was sent to Amsterdam as pupil to Peter Lastman, who was then rated the Apelles of the age. Lastman had returned from Rome to Holland with a classic emphasis on correct drawing. From him probably Rembrandt learned to be a superlative draftsman. But after a year in Amsterdam, the restless youth hurried back to Leiden, eager to paint after his own fashion. He drew or painted almost everything that he saw, including hilarious absurdities and shameless obscenities. He improved his art with fond experiments in self-portraiture. The mirror became his model. He has left us more self-portraits, at least 62, than many great painters have left paintings. Among these early autoritratti is a charming head in The Hague. Rembrandt at 23, handsome of course, for all mirrors show us handsome, hair carelessly tossed about with young superiority to conventions, eyes alert and proud with the confidence of proved ability. In fact, he had already established himself. In 1629 a connoisseur paid him 100 florins for a picture, quite a fee for a young competitor in a land where painters were as numerous as bakers, and not so amply fed. His first themes, after himself and his parents, were biblical. Jeremiah mourning the destruction of Jerusalem has the mystic aura that distinguishes Rembrandt's religious pictures, and Simeon in the Temple catches completely the spirit of Nunc dimittis servum tuum Domine. So many commissions came from Amsterdam that Rembrandt went back to it in 1631 and lived there the rest of his life. Within a year of his arrival, he painted one of the world's masterpieces, the anatomy lesson of Professor Nicholas Tulp. There had already been several anatomies in Dutch painting. No precedents were broken, no modesty violated, when the distinguished surgeon, 4 times burgomaster of Amsterdam, commissioned Rembrandt to picture him giving a demonstration in anatomy in the hall of the Surgeons' Guild. He planned to present the painting to the Guild as a memorial to his professorship. It was probably Dr. Tulp who chose the 7 students to share the picture with him, obviously not pupils, but men of maturity and standing either in medicine or in another field. And Rembrandt made full use of the opportunity to show faces illuminated with character and intelligence. The cadaver seems unduly inflated, and 2 of the onlookers are posing for posterity. Dr. Tulp himself takes the affair quite calmly, as one inured and confident. But the 2 men peering over the head of the corpse are curiosity and attention vivified, and the play of light upon flesh and ruffs announces Rembrandt's specialty. Commissions now flowed in 2 years, 40. With money in his pocket and hunger in his blood, the artist was ripe for marriage in 1634. Saskia Eulenburg had a lovely face, dancing eyes, hair of silk and gold, a comfortable figure and fortune. What could be lovelier than the Saskia in Kassel? She was the orphan daughter of a wealthy lawyer and magistrate. Perhaps her cousin, an art dealer, had induced her to sit to Rembrandt for a portrait. 2 sittings sufficed for a proposal. Saskia brought a dowry of 40,000 guilders, which made the future bankrupt one of the richest artists in history. She became a good wife despite her money. She bore patiently with her mate's absorbed genius. She sat for many pictures, though they revealed her expanding form. She let him deck her out in strange costumes for the rosy Flora now in London and the simpler wistful Flora in New York. We see his happiness in a Dresden painting where he holds her on his knee, irradiates the canvas with his smile, and raises a tall tumbler to his physical and financial ecstasy. In these grateful years, from 1634 to 1642, he turned out one masterpiece after another. He continued to picture himself. In the self-portrait of 1634 in the Louvre, handsome and jolly, with jewels in his hat and a gold chain on his chest. And again that year in An Officer, magnificent in a world-conquering hat, and in 1635 with a gorgeous hat whose plume tickles the sky. Looking for character rather than beauty, he painted in 1634 the old lady who looks down upon us from the walls of the National Gallery in London with a face corrugated by the years, and a year later the old woman in an armchair in New York. Among the human ruins of Amsterdam he found an octogenarian whom he dressed in turban and robes and pictured in an Oriental. He had a penchant for collecting costumes, jewelry, swords, fancy hats, and shoes. See them, except the sword, in Martin Day, with lace on his gloves, frills on his pants, and shields on his shoes. Now, too, he painted time-worn religious subjects with a fresh sincerity, taking his models from the old men and young women whom he met in the streets. Each picture so remarkable in technique, so striking in its manipulation of light, so moving in the intensity of its feeling, that any one of them might be defended as the artist's best. Let the sacrifice of Abraham and the angel Raphael leaving Tobias serve as examples. From these blessed years came some famous portraits, like the lady with a fan and a man with gloves, both defying words. The last achievement of this period, and perhaps the greatest picture that Rembrandt ever painted, was the immense canvas, 14 by 12 feet, that history knows as the Night Watch, but is more properly named Captain Cook's Company of Harquebusiers, from 1642. No detail is unfinished in that vast expanse, no shade of darkness or incidence of light is uncalculated, no contrast of color is unexplored. In the center the proud captain stands in brown and white and red. At his left a lieutenant in golden yellow boots and coat and hat. Swords gleam, pikes flash, pennants wave. At the right the fife and drum corps. The company emerges from its headquarters, apparently for some festival parade. Rembrandt had signed a contract with each of the 16 persons to be painted, each paying 100 florins. Many felt that equal pay had not been rewarded with equal prominence in the picture. Some complained that he had put them too deeply in shadows, or had neglected to make them recognizable by their friends. Few further group commissions came to his studio, and his prosperity began to wane. It must have been high in 1639, for in that year he bought a spacious house in the Joden Breedstraat, a street inhabited by well-to-do Jews. It cost him 13,000 florins, an enormous sum, which he never succeeded in paying off. Probably it was intended to shelter not only his family, but his pupils, his studio, and his growing collection of antiquities, curiosities, and art. After paying half the purchase price in the first year of occupancy, he let the rest remain as a debt, on which the unpaid interest rose to a point that eventually drove him to bankruptcy. Meanwhile, his beloved Saskia was declining in health. She had borne him 3 children, but each died in childhood, and their painful birth and tragic end weakened her hold on life. In 1641 she gave birth to a son, Titus, who survived. But in 1642 she passed away. Her will left all her possessions to Rembrandt, with the proviso that on his remarriage the remainder of her legacy should be transferred to her son. A year after her death, Rembrandt painted her from loving memory. That loss darkened his mood. Thenceforth he seemed obsessed with thoughts of death. Though deeply affectionate within his family, he had always preferred privacy to company. Now he courted a somber solitude. When he was painting, he brushed premature viewers away, telling them the smell of paint is not good for the health. He was not a cultured man of the world like Rubens. He read little, hardly anything but the Bible. He lived in a wordless realm of color, shadow, and light, as varied as the world of letters, but alien to it and unique. He had difficulty in donning the social graces when sitters came, and in making the small talk to keep them amused and still. They came in less number when they found that Rembrandt, like most of his predecessors, was not content to make a sketch from a sitting or two and then paint from the sketch, but preferred to paint directly on the canvas, which required many sittings. Moreover, he had an impressionistic way of painting what he thought or felt, rather than merely what he saw, and the result was not always flattering. It did not help him that his house was in the Jewish quarter. He had long since made friends with many Jews. He had engraved a portrait of Manasseh ben Israel in 1636. Now, in 1647, he painted on wood the dark face of the Jewish physician Ephraim Bonus. Almost surrounded by Hebrews, and evidently liking them, he found subjects increasingly among the Portuguese and Spanish Jews of Amsterdam. Perhaps he knew Baruch Spinoza, who lived in that city from 1632 till 1660. Some have thought that Rembrandt himself was Jewish. This is improbable, for he was christened and reared in a Protestant faith, and his features were completely Dutch. But he had no perceivable prejudice in religion or race. There is an especial depth of sympathetic understanding in his pictures of Jews. He was fascinated by their old men, their beards dripping wisdom, their eyes remembering grief. Half the Hebrew Calvary is in the face of an old Jew from 1654 in the Leningrad Hermitage, and in the portrait of a rabbi from circa 1657 in London. This last is the rabbi who, after Rembrandt's bankruptcy, gave him spiritual comfort and material aid. In 1649 we find him painting Hendrik Stoffels in bed, and we perceive that he has taken a mistress. She had been Saskia's maid. She stayed with the widowed artist, took faithful care of him, and soon consoled him with the warmth of her body. He did not marry her, for he was loath to relinquish Saskia's legacy to Titus, still a boy of 8. As he painted Hendrika in 1652, she was tolerably fair, with eyes of haunting wistfulness. It was probably she who posed for 2 studies in nudity in 1654, Bathsheba at the bath and A Woman Wading, both of them glories of color and amplitude. In July of that year she was summoned before the elders of the parish church, was severely reprimanded for adultery, and was excluded from the sacrament. In October she bore him a child. Rembrandt acknowledged it as his and managed to get it safely baptized. He learned to love his mistress as deeply as he had loved his wife. How else could he have put such tenderness in her face when he painted her in 1658 in the red robe that matched her hair? She was a good stepmother to Titus, who was growing up into a bewitching lad. See him in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, aged 14, as lovely as a girl, with the wondering eyes of youth, mystified by life and only half secure under paternal love. Or again in the Wallace collection, a year older. We can weakly imagine what a solace he must have been to Rembrandt, who in this year found economic realities crashing about his head. He labored to make ends meet. Some great religious pictures belong to this period, 1649 to 1656, of adultery and debt, Jacob blessing his grandchildren, Christ at the fountain, Christ and the woman of Samaria, and a descent from the cross. However, in Protestant Holland, ecclesiastical subjects were not in demand. He tried his hand at mythologies, but succeeded only when he could clothe the figures. Danae is uninviting, but Athenian Mars are unsurpassed in their kind. He continued to paint portraits of arresting character. Nicholas Breuning is snatched directly from a vivid moment of life and thought, and Jan Six is the Dutch burgomaster at his strongest and best. And about this time Rembrandt painted some nameless figures profoundly studied: the man with the golden helmet, the Polish rider, the centurion Cornelius. Beside these, most portraits seem surface sheen. Rembrandt was 50 when disaster came. He had seldom bothered to count his debits and credits. He had recklessly bought house and art, even shares in the Dutch East India Company. Now, as patronage lagged far behind maintenance, he found himself hopelessly in debt. In 1656, the Orphans' Chamber of Amsterdam, to protect Titus, transferred the house and grounds to the son, though the father was for a while allowed to live there. In July, Rembrandt was declared bankrupt. His furniture, paintings, drawings, and collections were sold in costly haste from 1657 to 1658, but the proceeds fell far short of his obligations. On December 4th, 1657, he was evicted. He moved from one house to another until at last he settled on the Rosengracht in the Jewish ghetto. Out of the wreck, some 7,000 florins were salvaged for Titus. He and Hendrikje, to protect Rembrandt, formed a partnership by which they could sell his remaining works without letting them go to his creditors. They seem to have taken loving care of the aging artist. Amid these tribulations he continued to spawn masterpieces: The Man on Horseback, The Wonderful Head of an Old Man, a Karl Marx in octogenarian disillusionment, the astonishingly vivid and natural woman cutting her nails, perhaps even part of the religious ritual that required cleansing of the whole body on the eve of the Sabbath. Now, too, he painted some startling self-portraits: Rembrandt with his sketchbook in 1657, the stern face and enveloped corpulence of the more famous portrait from 1658 in the Frick collection at New York, the full-figure portrait in 1659, the worried face from 1659 in Washington. In his final decade, from 1660 to 1669, he was kept alive by his son and his mistress, but his quarters were cramped, his studio was badly lighted, his hand must have lost some of its decisiveness as the result of age and drink. St. Matthew the Evangelist is coarse in its texture, but the angel whispering in his ear is none other than Titus, now 20 and still as fair as a bride. And then, in that year 1661, came the master's last triumph, the syndics of the Drapers' Guild. The stallmeesters, examiners and controllers of cloth, commissioned the old artist to commemorate them in a group picture to be hung in the hall of their corporation. We would have forgiven some hesitancy in the composition, some crudity in details, some carelessness in the incidents of light. But criticism is at a loss to find fault there. The subdued foreground and background make the 5 main figures leap to the eye, each of them a single and separate person, but all caught in the living moment of their common thought. In many paintings of these broken years, the connoisseurs find signs of failing energy and technique, simplicity of colors, neglect of details, a hasty sweep and crudity of the brush. And yet even then we have such arresting pictures as The Return of the Prodigal, an unforgettable portrayal of loving forgiveness, and The Jewish Bride. This is wondrous fruit to come from a dying tree. But we have said nothing of his landscapes, his drawings, and his etchings. Only a few of the landscapes stand out, but the drawings are at the top of their kind. Famous are the pen-and-ink view of Amsterdam in Vienna and an old woman sitting in Berlin. Rembrandt's etchings are prized as highly as any in the history of that painstaking art. One of them, Christ Healing the Sick, came to be known as the 100-guilder piece because it was bought for that unprecedented price, or about $1,200. In 1867, however, a copy of it brought 25,000 francs, or about $20,000. 300 etchings, 2,000 drawings, 650 paintings. This is the surviving oeuvre of Rembrandt, almost as widely known as Shakespeare's plays, almost as varied, original, and profound. Nearly all were from his own hand, for though he had aides, none of them shared his secret for revealing the invisible. Some of his work was careless, some of it repulsive, like the flayed ox in the Louvre. At times he was engrossed in technique, at times he skimped it for the vision's sake. He was as neutral as nature between beauty and ugliness, for to him truth was the ultimate beauty, and a picture representing ugliness truthfully was beautiful. He refused to idealize the figures in his biblical paintings. He suspected that those Old Testament Hebrews looked pretty much like the Jews of Amsterdam. He pictured them so, and in consequence they rise from myth or history into life. More and more, as he grew older, he loved the simple people around him rather than men dehumanized by the pursuit of gain. Where artists like Rubens sought their subjects among the beautiful, the happy, or the powerful, Rembrandt lavished his sympathetic art on the outcasts, the sick, the miserable, even the deformed. And though he made no show of religion, he seemed to embody unconsciously the attitude of Christ and Whitman toward those who had failed or had refused to compete in the war of each against all. We take a last look at him in the self-portraits of his old age. There is no vanity here. On the contrary, these are the autobiography of defeat. As he pictured himself in 1660, he was still facing life with a blend of courage and resignation. The pudgy, unshaved face was quizzical but not sad. He was still moving forward. But in another portrait of the same year, a worried look darkens and ridges the face around the rubicund nose. In 1661 he saw himself as baffled, but shrugged his wrinkles philosophically. And in his last year he pictured himself as having found peace in accepting the limits and the wry humor of life. Hendrikia died in 1662, but Titus still blessed him with the sight of youth, and in 1668 the old man rejoiced in the marriage of his son. When in that same year the son followed the mistress, the artist lost his hold on life. On October 8, 1669, the death register of the Westerkerk recorded, Rembrandt van Rijn, painter, leaves 2 children. His contemporaries hardly noticed his passing. None of them dreamed of ranking him with Rubens or even with Van Dyck. Joachim von Sandrart, his contemporary, wrote of him, what he chiefly lacked was knowledge of Italy and of other places which afford opportunities for the study of the antique and of the theory of art. This now seems to us the secret of his greatness. Had he managed his affairs more prudently and shown more amenity in society, he might have been a richer man. His art suffered from his predilection for the society of the vulgar. Ruskin agreed with the German historian of art. Vulgarity, dullness, or impiety will always express themselves through art in brown and grays as in Rembrandt. It is the aim of the best painters to paint the noblest things they can see by sunlight. It was the aim of Rembrandt to paint the foulest things he could see by rushlight. But Eugène Delacroix, reflecting democratic developments in France, thought, perhaps we shall one day find that Rembrandt is a greater painter than Raphael. I write down, without taking sides, this blasphemy, which will cause the hair of the academicians to stand on end. The tendency among art critics today is to rate Rembrandt above Raphael and Velázquez, equaled only by El Greco. Truth, we perceive, is a function and vassal of time. From Rubens to Rembrandt, what a gamut and chasm, between joyous light and somber shadow, between the abyss and the court, between the happy sensuality of the Antwerp noble, at home in palaces and with kings, and the Amsterdam bankrupt who knew the lower depths and was acquainted with grief. To see these two men as the contrapuntal elements of a mighty harmony is to feel in another way the greatness of the little nation that had fought a giant empire, to feel the complexity of a civilization that could produce at one end a Catholic culture gladly adorning its unquestioned creed with myths and its beloved shrines with art, and at the other a Protestant culture that could nourish the greatest artist and the greatest philosopher of the age. Chapter 19. The Rise of the North, 1559 to 1648. 1. Denmark as a great power. Let us look at the map, for maps, like faces, are the signatures of history. When Frederick II ascended its throne in 1559, Denmark was one of the strongest and most far-reaching states in Europe. It had not yet learned how clever it is to be small. In the perennial contest with Sweden for control of the commerce between the North Sea and the Baltic, Denmark was at first the victor, even extending its rule across the Skagerrak to and throughout Norway, and across the Kattegat into what is now South Sweden. It held the strategic cities of Copenhagen and Helsingør on the west side, and Malmö and Helsingborg on the east side of the Øresund, or Sound. the swirling waters, in one place only 3.5 miles wide, that now separate Denmark from Sweden. Farther east it held, through most of this period, the islands of Bornholm, Gotland, and Ursel, thereby controlling the Baltic Sea. On the south it included the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, and far away in the northwest it ruled Iceland and Greenland. The tolls charged by Denmark on commerce passing through the straits between the seas were the chief source of the kingdom's revenues and wars. Political power resided in the 800 nobles who owned half the land, kept the peasants in serfdom, elected the king, and ruled the country through the Riksdag, or national diet, and the Rigsråd, or council of state. They had profited from the Reformation by absorbing most of the property formerly belonging to the Catholic Church. In return for exemption from taxation, they were expected, but they often refused, to arm and lead their peasants in war at the call of the king. The Protestant clergy, shorn of wealth, had a minor social standing and little political influence. However, they controlled education and held a censorship over literature, which consequently produced mainly theology and hymns. The general population, numbering 1 million, enjoyed heavy meals and heavy drinking. A barber surgeon advised his clients, "It is very good for persons to drink themselves intoxicated once a month, for the excellent reasons that it frees their strength, furthers sound sleep, eases the passing of water, increases perspiration, and stimulates general well-being." 2 Danes in this period have a special claim on history: Tycho Brahe, the greatest astronomer of his generation, and Christian IV, who not only was king of Denmark for 60 years, from 1588 to 1648, but would have been a leader of men even without the advantage of royal birth. We pass by his father, Frederick II, merely noting that for him the Flemish architect Antonis van Oberger designed, between 1574 and 1585, the fortress of Kronborg Castle at Helsingør, Hamlet's Elsinore. When Frederick died in 1588, Christian was a boy of 11. A regency of 4 nobles ruled for 8 years. Then Christian took the reins. For the next half-century he lived the abundant life with such exuberance and versatile energy that all Europe marveled. He bettered the instruction of the aforesaid barber-surgeon, for he regularly required to be helped home after an evening's carouse. His profanity set a standard that few of his subjects surpassed. The number of his bastards created a problem in accountancy. His people laughed these popular faults away and loved him, for he danced at their weddings, joined in their labor, and risked his life repeatedly in their service. To all this he added a knowledge of Latin and science, an educated taste in the arts, and a simple religious faith that raised no sophomoric questions about credibility and no qualms about fun. In his spare time he helped to make Copenhagen one of Europe's most attractive capitals. His building program doubled the circumference of the city. In his reign, Schloss, or Castle Rosenborg, took form. Soon thereafter, the Bourse spread its vast facade and raised its twisted steeple high. He reformed the government of Norway, developed its industries, and rebuilt its capital, which for 3 centuries bore his name as Christiania. It was renamed Oslo in 1925. In Denmark, he improved administration, promoted manufactures, organized commercial companies, founded colleges and towns, and raised the condition of the peasants on the crown estates. Ambition toppled him, for he dreamed of reuniting all Scandinavia under one head, his own. The nobles objected that Sweden was unconquerable, and they refused their support. Chiefly with foreign mercenaries, he waged against Sweden the Kalmar War from 1611 to 1613. When the 30 Years' War came, he found himself uncomfortably allied with Sweden in defense of the Protestant cause. That peril over, he resumed the struggle with Sweden in 1643, though he was now 67 years old. He led his inadequate forces with romantic ardor. In the naval battle of Kolberg in 1644, he fought all through the day, despite 20 wounds and a blinded eye, and won a temporary victory. In the end, Sweden proved stronger, and the Peace of Brömsebro in 1645 freed Sweden from paying dues for her commerce in the Sound, and ceded to her Gotland, Ursel, and 3 provinces on the Scandinavian peninsula. When Christian IV died, after 15 years of constructive labor and destructive wars, his kingdom was smaller than at his accession, and the ascendancy of Denmark had passed away. 2. Sweden, 1560 to 1654. 1. The Rival Faiths, 1560 to 1611. Between Gustavus Vasa, the founder of modern Sweden, and Gustavus Adolphus, the savior of Protestantism, Swedish history is clouded by the contest of religious creeds for political power. The first Vasa had freed Sweden from Denmark and had united his country under a strong hereditary monarchy, while noble oligarchies kept Denmark and Poland feudal and weak. The Swedish peasantry was free and was represented, along with the nobles, the clergy, and the towns, in the Riksdag or Diet. The same word bonde that in Denmark had come to mean serf was in Sweden the proud title of a freeman tilling his own soil. But the resources of the land were severely limited by climate, by inadequate population, and by Danish control of 3 peninsular provinces and the Sound. The nobles chafed in their new subordination to the king, and the Catholic Church, despoiled of her Swedish wealth, plotted patiently to recapture the people, her property, and the throne. Vasa's son, Eric XIV, from 1560 to 1568, was unfitted to meet these problems. He had courage and ability, but his violent temper stultified his diplomacy and led him to murder and madness. He infuriated the nobles by killing 5 of their leaders, one with his own hand. He carried on against Denmark the Northern 7 Years' War, from 1563 to 1570, and prepared future wars by conquering Livonia. He alienated his brother John by obstructing a marriage that would have made John heir to the Polish crown, and when John nevertheless married Princess Catherine Jagellon, Eric shut him up in the fortress of Gripsholm. Catherine came to share the rigors of John's imprisonment and inclined his ear to the Catholic faith. In 1560, Eric's brothers compelled him to abdicate, and after 6 years in confinement he was put to death by order of the Riksdag and the new king. John III, from 1568 to 1592, made peace with Denmark and his nobles, and renewed the conflict of the faiths. His wife pleaded with him, more by night than by day, to accept Catholicism. With his permission, Jesuits entered Sweden in disguise, and the ablest of them, Antonio Posivino, undertook the conversion of the king. John's conscience burned with the memory that he had consented to his brother's death. For such a fratricide the fires of hell seemed an inevitable punishment. This, Posivino urged, could be escaped only by confession and absolution in the Church, which all believed to have been founded by Christ. John yielded. He received the sacrament according to the Roman rite and promised to make Catholicism the religion of the state, provided the Pope would allow the Swedish clergy to marry, the Mass to be celebrated in the vernacular, and the Eucharist to be administered in wine as well as bread. Posivino went to Rome. The Pope rejected the conditions. Posivino returned empty-handed. John ordered the Jesuits to receive the sacrament in both kinds and recite the Mass in Swedish. They refused and departed. In 1584, Catholic Catherine died. A year later, John married a Protestant lady who, more by night than by day, brought him back to the Lutheran faith. In August 1587, his Catholic son was elected to the Polish throne as Sigismund III. By the Statute of Kalmar, father and son agreed that after John's death, Sigismund should reign over both Poland and Sweden. But Sigismund pledged himself to respect Sweden's political independence and Protestant faith. When John died in 1592, the Riksdag, under the lead of his brother Duke Charles, met at Uppsala on February 25, 1593, with 300 clergymen and 300 laymen, nobles, burgesses, miners, and peasants, and adopted the Lutheran Augsburg Confession of 1530 as the official creed of the Swedish Church and State. The historic synod, Uppsala Möte, declared that no religion but Lutheranism was to be tolerated in the nation, that none but Orthodox Lutherans were to be appointed to ecclesiastical or political office, and that Sigismund would be crowned in Sweden only after he had accepted these principles. Meanwhile, Duke Charles was recognized as regent in the absence of the king. Sigismund, who had been educated by the Jesuits, dreamed of bringing Sweden and Russia into the Catholic fold. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.